If I had $1,000,000, I know just what I would do. I'd tie a string around the world and bring all of it to you. Those little things you prayed for, whatever they may be, I'd have enough to pay for them all, C.O.D. If I spent $1,000,000, I know I would never care, because as long as you were mine, I'd still be a millionaire. That's why I'm always dreaming of what I do. If I had $1,000,000 and you.
Hello, wonderful individuals. Today we're going to be reading from Dion Fortune's book, The Mystical Kabbalah, which is a super classic. It's probably the finest book on cut and dry theory of what's going on with the Kabbalah that you can find that's told from a sort of witchy occultic perspective. She talks a lot about Christian influence. That's kind of seeped in here, but you can pull that out. Don't worry about that. I'm just going to read everything she says about Tiphareth. And as I go through it, it's going to be quite a rant here. But Tiphareth is the center of the tree. And this book is incredible. And I could sit here, everything that's in here I would read and post on this channel, but it would take forever. So this is just going to be about Tiphareth. And I kept, like a man jumping up and down, screaming on fire. You have to get this book. Her last name, it looks like it's spelled fortune, but it's Fortune. And her real name was Violet Firth. But Dion, D-I-O-N, Fortune. So this is about Tiphareth, the sixth bubble, the sixth Sephiroth of the Tree of Life. It's what is the yellow one. It's the sun. And from here, you're going to learn everything you need to know as far as that is concerned. So, number one, there are three important keys to the nature of Tiphareth. Firstly, it is the center of equilibrium of the whole tree, being in the middle of the center pillar. Secondly, it is Keter on a lower arc and Yesod on a higher arc, which is the ace and the moon. Thirdly, it is the point of transmutation between the planes of force and the planes of form. The titles that are bestowed on it in Kabbalistic nomenclature bear this out. From the point of view of Keter, it is a child. From the point of view of Malkut, it is a king. And from the point of view of the transmutation of force, it is a sacrificed god. Number two, macrocosmically, that is to say from Keter standpoint, Tiphareth is the equilibrium of Chesed and Gebura. Microcosmically, that is to say that from the point of view of transcendental psychology, it is the point where the types of consciousness characteristic of Keter and Yesod are brought to a focus. Hod and Netzach equally find their synthesis in Tiphareth. Number three, the six Sephiroth, with which Tiphareth is the center, are sometimes called Adam Kadmon, the archetypal man. In fact, Tiphareth cannot rightly be understood save as a central point of these six, wherein it rules as a king in his kingdom. It is these six which, for all practical purposes, constitute the archetypal kingdom which lies behind the kingdom of form and Malkut and completely dominates and determines the passivities of matter. Number 4, when we have to consider a sephira in relation to its neighbors in order to interpret in the light of its position on the tree, it is not possible to proceed with an entirely systematic and orderly exposition of the Kabbalistic system, for we must of necessity forestall with partial explanations if our argument is to be comprehensible. We must therefore give some explanation of the 3 lower sephirot grouped around Tiphareth, Nesag, Hod, and Yesod. Nesag is concerned with the nature forces and elemental contacts, Hod with ceremonial magic and occult knowledge, and Yesod with psychism and the etheric double. Tiphareth itself, supported by Geburah and Gedula, Mars and Jupiter, represents seership, or the higher psychism of the individuality. Each sephira, of course, has its subjective and objective aspects, its factor in psychology, and its plane in the universe. Number 6, the 4 sephira below Tiphareth represent the personality or lower self. The 4 sephirot above Tiphareth are the individuality or higher self, and the Keter is the divine spark or nucleus of manifestation. Number 7, Tiphareth, therefore, must never be regarded as an isolated factor, but as a link, a focusing point, a center of transition or transmutation. The central pillar is always concerned with consciousness, the 2 side pillars with the different modes of the operation of force on the different levels. In Tiphareth, we find the archetypal ideals brought to a focus and transmuted into archetypal ideas. It is, in fact, the place of incarnation. For this reason, it is called the child. And because incarnation of the God ideal also implies the sacrificial disincarnation, to Tiphareth are assigned the mysteries of the crucifixion, and all the sacrificed gods are placed here within the tree when applied to the pantheons. God the Father is assigned to Keter, but God the Son is assigned to Tiphareth for the reasons given above. Number 9, exoteric religion goes no farther up the tree than Tiphareth. It has no understanding of the mysteries of creation as represented by the symbolism of Keter, Chokmah, and Binah, nor of the modes of operation of the dark and bright archangels as represented in the symbolism of Geburah and Gedula, nor the mysteries of consciousness and the transmutation of force as represented in the invisible Sephirah Deat, which has no symbolism. Number 10, in Tiphareth, God is made manifest in form and dwells among us, i.e. comes within range of human consciousness. Tiphareth the Son shows us Keter the Father. In order that form may be stabilized, the component forces out of which it is built must be brought into equilibrium. Therefore, do we find the idea of the mediator or redeemer inherent in this Sephirah. When the Godhead is very self-manifest in form, that form must be perfectly equilibrated. One might, with equal truth, reverse the proposition and say that when the forces building a form are perfectly equilibrated, the Godhead, its very self, is manifesting in that form according to its type. God is made manifest among us when the conditions permit of manifestation. Number 12, having come through into manifestation on the planes of form in the child aspect of Tiphareth, the incarnated God grows to manhood and becomes the Redeemer. In other words, having obtained incarnation by means of matter in a virgin state, i.e. Mary, Mara, the sea, the great mother, Binah, supernal, as distinguished from the inferior mother, Malkut, the developing God manifestation is forever striving to bring the kingdom of the 6 central Sephirot into a state of equilibrium. When the glyph of the fall is represented upon the tree, it is interesting to note that the heads of the great serpent they raise out of the chaos only come as far as Deat and do not surpass it. The Redeemer then manifests in Tiphareth and is forever striving to redeem his kingdom by reuniting it to the supernals across the gulf made by the fall, which separated the lower Sephirot from the higher, and by bringing the diverse forces of the sixfold kingdom into equilibrium. Number 15, to this end are the incarnated gods sacrificed, dying for the people, in order that the tremendous emotional force set free by this act may compensate the unbalanced force of the kingdom and thus redeem it or bring it into equilibrium. It is the sphere on the tree that is called the Christian center, or the Christ center. The Christ center of Christ consciousness, perhaps. And it is here that the Christian religion has its focusing point. The pantheistic faiths, such as the Greek and Egyptian, center in Yesod. The metaphysical faiths, such as the Buddhist and Confucian, aim at Keter. But as all religions worthy of the name have an esoteric or mystical and an exoteric or pantheistic aspect, Christianity, although it is essentially a Tiphareth faith, has its mystical aspect centering in Keter, and its magical aspect, as seen in popular continental Catholicism, centering in Yesod. Its evangelical aspect aims at a concentration on Tiphareth as a child and sacrifice god, and ignores the aspect of the king in the center of his kingdom, surrounded by the five holy Sephiroth in manifestation. Hitherto, we have considered the tree from the macrocosmic point of view, seeing the different archetypes of manifesting force come into action and build the universe, and have but remotely approached them from the microcosmic point of view in their psychological aspect as factors in consciousness. But with Tiphareth, our mode of approach changes, from henceforward the archetypal forces are locked up in forms and can only be approached from the point of view of their effect upon consciousness. In other words, our mode of approach must now be through the direct experience of the senses, though these senses are not of the physical plane only, but function in both Tiphareth and Yesod, each according to type. While we were on the higher levels, we had to rely on metaphysical analogy and reasoning by deduction from first principles. Now we are within the legitimate field of inductive science and must submit ourselves to its discipline and express our findings in its terms. But at the same time, we must maintain our links with the transcendentals through Tiphareth. This is achieved by expressing the symbolism of Tiphareth in terms of mystical experience. All mystical experiences of the type in which the vision ends in blinding light are assigned to Tiphareth. For the fading out of form in the overwhelming influx of force characterizes the transitional mode of consciousness of this sphere on the tree. Visions which maintain clearly outlined form throughout are characteristic of Yesod. Illuminations which have no form, such as those described by Plotinus, are rising towards Keter. Number 18. In Tiphareth also are gathered up and interpreted the operations of the nature magic of Netzach and the hermetic magic of Hod. Both these operations are in terms of form, though form predominates in the operation of Hod to a greater degree than those of Netzach. All the astral visions of Yesod also must be translated in terms of metaphysics via the mystical experience of Tiphareth. If this translation is not made, we become hallucinated, for we think the reflections cast into the mirror of the subconscious mind and translated there into terms of brain consciousness are the actual things of which they are really only symbolic representations. Number 19, Keter is metaphysical, Yesod is psychic, and Tiphareth is essentially mystical. Mystical being understood as a mode of mentation in which consciousness ceases to work in symbolic subconscious representations, but apprehends by means of emotional reactions. The different additional titles and symbolism assigned to the various Sephiroth, and especially the god names thereof, give us a very important key for the unlocking of the mysteries of the Bible, which is essentially a Kabbalistic book. According to the manner in which deity is referred to, we know to what sphere on the tree the particular mode of manifestation should be assigned. All references to the Son always refer to Tiphareth. All references to the Father refer to Keter. All references to the Holy Ghost refer to Yesod. And very deep mysteries are concealed here, for the Holy Ghost is the aspect of the Godhead that is worshipped in the occult lodges. The worship of pantheistic nature forces and elemental operations take place under the presidency of God the Father and the regenerative ethical aspect of religion, which is the exoteric aspect for this epoch, is under the presidency of God the Son in Tiphareth. The number 21, the initiate, however, transcends his epoch and aims at uniting all three modes of adoration in his worship of deity as a trinity in unity. The Son redeeming the pantheistic nature worship from debasement and making the transcendental Father comprehensible to human consciousness. For whoso hath seen me hath seen the Father. Tiphareth, however, is not only the center of the sacrifice god, but also the center of the inebriating god, the giver of illumination. Dionysus is assigned to the center, as well as Osiris, for, as we have already seen, the central pillar is concerned with the modes of consciousness, and human consciousness, rising from Yesod by the path of the arrow, receives illumination in Tiphareth. Therefore, all the givers of illumination in the pantheons are assigned to Tiphareth. Illumination consists in the introduction of the mind to a higher mode of consciousness than that which is built up out of sensory experience. In illumination, the mind changes gear, as it were. Unless, however, the new mode of consciousness is connected up with the old and translated into terms of finite thought, it remains as a flash of light so brilliant that it blinds. We do not see by means of the ray of light that shines upon us, but by means of the amount of that ray which is reflected from objects of our own dimension upon which it lights. Unless there are ideas in our minds which are illuminated by this higher mode of consciousness, our minds are merely overwhelmed, and the darkness is more intense to our eyes after that blinding experience of a high mode of consciousness than it was before. In fact, we do not so much change gear as to throw the engine of our mind out of gear altogether. This, for the most part, is what so-called illumination amounts to. There is enough of a flash to convince us of the reality of the superphysical existence, but not enough to teach us anything of its nature. Number 24. The importance of the Tiphareth stage in mystical experience lies in the fact that the incarnation of the child takes place here. In other words, mystical experience gradually builds up a body of images and ideas that are lit up and made visible when illuminations take place. This child aspect of Tiphareth is also a very important one to us in such practical work of the mysteries as is concerned with illumination. For we must accept the fact that the child Christ does not spring like Minerva, full-armed from the head of the God of the Father, but starts as a small thing, humbly laid among the beasts, and not even housed in the inn with the humans. The first glimpses of mystical experience must perforce be very limited, because we have not had time to build up through experience a body of images and ideas that shall serve to represent them. These can only be got together with time, each transcendental experience adding its quota and subsequent rational meditation organizing them. Mystics are very apt to make the mistake of thinking that they are following the star to the place of Sermon on the Mount, not to the manger at Bethlehem, the birthplace. It is here that the method of the tree is so valuable, enabling the transcendent to be expressed in terms of symbolism, and symbolism to be translated in terms of metaphysics, thus linking the psychic with the spiritual via the intellect, and bringing all three aspects of our Trinitarian consciousness into focus. It is in Tiphareth that this translation is made, for in Tiphareth are received the mystical experiences of direct consciousness which illuminate the psychic symbols. The great pillar of the tree is essentially the pillar of consciousness, just as the two sides pillars are the pillars of the active and passive powers. When considered microcosmically, that is to say, from the point of view of psychology instead of cosmology, Keter, the divine spark round which the individualized being builds up, must be regarded as the nucleus of consciousness rather than consciousness itself. Deat, the invisible Sephira, is also on the central pillar, though, strictly speaking, it always belongs to another plane, to that on which the tree is being considered. For instance, as we have considering the tree microcosmically at the moment, Deat would be the point of contact with the macrocosm. It is not until we come to Tiphareth that we get clear-cut, individualized consciousness. Tiphareth is the functional apex of the second triad on the tree, whose two basal angles consist of Geburah and Gedula, quote-unquote just said. This second triad, emanating from the first triad of the three supernals, forms the evolving individuality or spiritual soul. It is this which endures and builds up throughout in evolution. It is from this that the successive personalities, the units of incarnation, are emanated. It is into this that the active essence of experience is absorbed at the end of each incarnation when the incarnating unit dissolves into dust and ether. It is this second triad which forms the oversoul, the higher self, the holy guardian angel, the first initiator. It is the voice of this higher self which is so often heard with the inner ear, and not the voice of disincarnate entities or of God himself, as is thought by those who have had no training in tradition. Overshadowed and directed by the second triad, the third triad builds up through the experience of incarnation, and with Malkut as its physical vehicle. Brain consciousness is of Malkut, and as long as we are imprisoned in Malkut, that is all we have. But the doors of Malkut are not closely shut nowadays, and many there are who can peer through the crack at the phantasmagoria of the astral plane and experience the psychic consciousness of Yesod. When this has been achieved, the way opens for the higher psychism, the true seership, which is characteristic of the consciousness of Tiphareth. Our first experience of the higher psychism, therefore, is usually in terms of the lower psychism to commence with, for we have only just risen clear of Malkut and are looking up at the son of Tiferet from the moon sphere of Yesod. Therefore, we hear voices with the inner ear and see visions with the inner eye, but they differ from ordinary psychic consciousness because they are not the direct representations of astral forms, but symbolic presentations of spiritual things in terms of astral consciousness. This is a normal function of the subconscious mind. It is very important that it should be thoroughly understood, for misconceptions on this point give rise to various serious problems and may even lead to mental unbalance. Those who are familiar with Kabbalistic terminology know that the first of the greater initiations is said to consist of the power to enjoy the knowledge and conversation of our holy guardian angel. This holy guardian angel, be it remembered, is really our own higher self. It is the prime characteristic of this higher mode of mentation that it consists neither in voices nor visions, but is pure consciousness. It is an intensification of awareness, and from this quickening of the mind comes a peculiar power of insight and penetration, which is of the nature of hyper-developed intuition. The higher consciousness is never psychic, but always intuitive, containing no sensory image. It is this absence of sensory image which tells the experienced initiate that he is on the higher level of the higher consciousness. The ancients recognized this, and they differentiated between the mantic methods, which induced the chthonic or underworld contacts, and the divine inebriation of the mysteries. The Maenads rushing in the train of Dionysus were of entirely different order of initiation to the Pythonists. The Pythonists were psychics and mediums, but the Maenads, the initiates of the Dionysiac mysteries, enjoyed exaltation of consciousness and a quickening of life that enabled them to perform amazing prodigies of strength. All the dynamic religions have this Dionysiac aspect. Even in the Christian religion, many saints have left record of the crucified Christ of their devotion coming to them at least as the divine bridegroom. And when they speak of this divine inebriation that comes to them, their language uses the metaphors of human love as appropriate expression. How lovely art thou, my sister, my spouse, faint from the kisses of the lips of God. These things tell a great deal to those who have understanding. The Dionysiac aspect of religion represents an essential factor in human psychology, and it is the misunderstanding of this factor which, upon the one hand, prevents the manifestation of the higher spiritual experiences in our modern civilization, and upon the other permits the strange aberrations of religious feeling that from time to time give rise to scandal and tragedy in the high places of the more dynamic religious movements. There is a certain emotional concentration and exaltation which makes the higher phases of consciousness available, and without which it is impossible to attain them. The images of the astral plane pass over into an intensity of emotion that is like a burning fire, and when all the dross of the nature that has gone up in flame, the smoke clears, and we are left with the white heat of pure consciousness. By the very nature of the human mind, with the brain as its instrument, this white heat cannot endure for long, but in the brief space of its lasting changes occurs in the temperament, and the mind itself receives new concepts and undergoes an expansion that never wholly retracts. The tremendous exaltation of the experience dies away, but we are left with a permanent expansion of personality, an enhanced capacity for life in general, and a power of realization of spiritual realities which could never have been ours if we had not swung forcibly across the great gulf of consciousness by the momentum of ecstasy. Modern spiritual leaders have no knowledge of the technique of the deliberate production of ecstasy, and no idea how to direct it when it occurs spontaneously. Revivalists succeed in producing a mild form of it among unsophisticated people by means of personal magnetism, and the worth of a revivalist is judged by his power to inebriate his hearers. But the consequences of this inebriation are apt to be like the consequences of any other inebriation, and life seems exceedingly stale, flat, and unprofitable when the revivalist moves on to other fields of activity. Because the inebriation dies away, the convert thinks he has lost God, and no one seems to realize that ecstasy is a magnesium flash in consciousness, and if it were prolonged, would burn up the brain and nervous system. But although it cannot be, and it is not meant to be prolonged, by means of it, we swing over the dead center of consciousness and awake to a higher life. The technique of the tree gives accurate definition to these spiritual experiences, and those who are trained in that technique do not mistake the stirring of their own higher consciousness for the voice of God. From the sensory consciousness of Malkut, through the astral psychism of Yesod, to the formless intuitions and quickened consciousness of Tiferet, they rise and descend smoothly and skillfully, never confusing the planes or suffering them to leak one into another, but bringing them all into focus in a centralized consciousness. Tiferet is called by the Kabbalist Shemesh, or the sphere of the sun. It is interesting to note that all the sun gods are healing gods, and all healing gods are sun gods, a fact which affords us food for thought. The sun is the central point of our existence. Without the sun, there would be no solar system. Sunlight plays a very important part in the metabolism, the life process of living creatures, and the whole of the nutrition of green plants depends upon it. Its influence is closely allied to that of vitamins, as is proved by the fact that certain vitamins can be used to supplement its activities. We see, therefore, that sunlight is a very important factor in our well-being. We might go even further and say it is essential to our very existence, and that our association with the sun is far more intimate than we realize. The symbol of the sun in the mineral kingdom is gold, pure and precious, which all nations have agreed in calling the metal of the sun and recognizing as the most precious metal and the basic unit of exchange. The part played by gold in the policy of nations far exceeds its intrinsic utility as a metal. It is, moreover, the one substance on earth which is incorruptible and untarnishable. It may be dulled by the accumulation of dirt upon its surface, but the metal itself, unlike silver or iron, undergoes no chemical change or decomposition. Neither does water corrode it. The sun is to us truly the giver of life and the source of all being. It is the only adequate symbol of God the Father, who may aptly be called the sun behind the sun. Tiphareth, in fact, being the immediate reflection of Keter. It is through the mediation of the sun that life comes to earth, and it is by means of the Tipheric consciousness that we can contact the sources of vitality and draw upon them, both consciously and unconsciously. The sun is, above all things, the symbol of manifesting energy. It is sudden, unaccustomed gushes of solar spiritual energy that cause the divine inebriation of ecstasy. It is gold as the basis of money, which is the objective representative of externalized life force. For verily, money is life, and life is money, and for without money we cannot have fullness of life. Life force, manifesting on the physical plane as energy and on the mental plane as intelligence and knowledge, can be transmuted by the appropriate alchemy into money, which is a token of the capacity or energy of someone. Money is the symbol of human energy, by means of which we can store up our output of work hour by hour, receiving it back as wages at the end of the week, and spending it on necessities or saving it for future years as we think fit. The gold which backs the notes is a symbol of human energy and is only earned by an expenditure of that energy. Though it may be the energy of a father or husband transmuted through an heiress, yet nevertheless it is a symbol of some human being's activity in some sphere, even if it be only the sphere of a company promoting or burglary. The secret underground movements of gold act in the policy of nations as hormones act in the human body, and there are cosmic laws governing their tidal and epochal movements which economists do not suspect. Keter, space, the source of all existence, reflects into Tiferet, which acts as a transformer and distributor of the primal spiritual energy. We receive this energy directly by means of sunlight and indirectly by means of the chlorophyll and green plants, which enables them to utilize sunlight, and which we eat at first hand in vegetable foods, and at second hand in the tissues of herbivorous creatures. But the sun god is more than the source of life. He is also the healer when life goes wrong. For it is life, plus, minus, or misdirected, which is the activity in disease processes. Disease has no energy save what it borrows from the life of the organism. It is therefore by adjustments in the life force that healing must be brought about, and the sun gods are the natural gods to invoke this connection, for life and the sun are so intimately connected. It is by means of their knowledge and of the manipulation of the solar influence that the ancient initiate priests performed their healings, and sun worship lay at the root of the Asclepian cult of ancient Greece. We moderns have learned the value of sunlight and vitamins in our physiological economy, but we have not realized the very important part played by the spiritual aspect of the solar influences in our psychic economy. Using that word in its dictionary sense, there's a Tipheric factor in the soul of man, which, according to ancient tradition, has its physical correspondent in the solar plexus, not in the head or the heart, which is able to pick up the subtle aspect of the solar energy in the same way the chlorophyll in the leaf of a plant picks up its more tangible aspect. If we are cut off from this energy and prevented from assimilating it, we become as sickly and feeble in mind and body as plants growing in a cellar cut off from its most tangible aspect. This cutting off from the spiritual aspect of nature is due to mental attitudes. When we refuse to acknowledge our part in nature and nature's part in us, we inhibit this free flow of life-giving magnetism between the part and the whole, and lacking certain elements essential to spiritual function, psychic health is impossible. Psychoanalysis attach great importance to repression as a cause of psychic disease. They learned to recognize repression because in its extreme form of sex repression, its ill effects are conspicuous. They did not realize, however, that sex repression, unless it is caused by circumstances, in which case it does not give rise to dissociation, is but the result of a cause which lies far deeper than sex and has its root in a false spirituality, a spurious refinement and idealism, which has led to the cutting off of sympathies, of the recognition of the gratitude of a living creature from the giver of life, the higher aspects of nature. This caused by a spiritual vanity which considers the more primitive aspects of nature as beneath its dignity. It is because our spurious ideals, with their false values, that we have so much more neurotic ill health in our midst. It is because Priapus and Cloacina are not given their due as deities that we are cursed by the sun god and cut off from his benign influence. For an insult to his subsidiary aspects is an insult to him. When a creature is not in a fit state for reproduction, sexual advances are repellent to it. This is the natural basis of modesty and protects the organism from waste and exhaustion, because an accumulation of decomposing excreta gives rise to the disease. The odor of their excreta is repulsive to living creatures or of even the lowliest development, so that they avoid its neighborhood. Out of these two repulsions, so rational and valuable under natural conditions, under our artificial conditions of civilized life, all manner of irrational taboos have grown up. The repulsion is overdone and no longer serves its biological purpose. Our attitude towards two important sections of natural life implies that they are unnatural, debased, and poisonous. Consequently, we cut ourselves off from the earth contacts, then the circuit is broken, and the heavenly contacts also fail us. The cosmic current comes down from Keter through Tiferet and Yesod into Malkut. If the circuit be broken anywhere, it cannot function. True, it is impossible totally to break the circuit during life, for the life processes are so deeply rooted in nature that we cannot altogether suppress them. But a mental attitude can cause such a kinking of the tube, as it were. We can so insulate and inhibit that only a scanty flow can be sucked through against resistance by the desperate organism. In Tiferet, the Sun Center, we have a spiritual manifesting in the natural. And we should give reverence to the sun god as representing the naturalization of spiritual processes. The spiritualization of a natural processes has had a good deal to answer for in the history of human suffering. The symbols assigned to the sixth Tiphareth become a very illuminating study when we examine them in light of what we now know about the significance of Tiphareth. For we have here a very clear example of the way in which the symbols assigned to a given Sephira lace in and out, in long chains of interrelated associations. The meaning of the Hebrew word Tiferet is beauty, and any of the many definitions of beauty have been proposed. The most satisfying is that which finds beauty to lie in a due and just proportion, whatever the beautiful thing may be, whether moral or material. It is interesting, therefore, to find the Sephira of beauty as the central point of equilibrium of the whole tree, and that one of the two spiritual experiences assigned to Tiferet is the vision of the harmony of things. It is curious that two separate and, at first sight, unrelated spiritual experiences should be assigned to Tiferet. It is, in fact, the only sphere on the tree where this occurs. It is also unique in having several magical images assigned to it. We must therefore ask ourselves why it is that the central Sephira has these multiple aspects. The answer is to be found in the Yetziarech text assigned to Tiferet, which declares that the sixth path is called the mediating intelligence. A mediator is essentially a connecting link, an intermediary. Consequently, Tiphareth, in its central position, must be looked upon as a two-way switch, and we must consider it both as receiving the influxes of the emanations and as causing the influx to flow into all the reservoirs of the blessings. We may therefore look upon it as the outward manifestation of the 5 subtler Sephiroth, and also as the spiritual principle behind the 4 denser Sephiroth. If looked at from the side of form, it is force. If looked at from the side of force, it is form. It is, in fact, the archetypal Sephira in which the great principles represented by the 5 higher Sephira are formulated into concepts. In it are multiplied the influxes of the emanations, as the Sefer Yetzirah declares. The name Zohar Anpin, lesser countenance, as distinguished from Arik Anpin, the vast countenance, one of the titles of Keter, further bears out this idea. For the formless formulations of Keter take shape in this, the sphere of the higher mind. As previously noted, Keter is reflected into Tiphareth. The Ancient of Days sees himself reflected as in a glass, and the reflected image of the vast countenance is called the lesser countenance and the sun. But although a lesser manifestation and a younger generation as viewed from above, Tiphareth is also Adam Kadmon, the archetypal man, when viewed from beneath, from the side, that is to say, of Yesod and Malkut. Tiphareth is Malak, the king, the husband of Malka, the bride, which is one of the titles of Malkut. It is in Tiphareth that we find the archetypal ideas which form the invisible framework of the whole of manifested creation, formulating and expressing the primary principles emanating from the subtler Sephira. It is, as it were, a treasure house of images on a higher arc, but whereas the astral plane is peopled by images reflected from forms, the images of the sphere of Tiphareth are those formulating and, as it were, crystallizing out from the spiritual emanations of the higher potencies. Tiphareth mediates between the microcosm and the macrocosm. As above, so below. It is the keynote of the sphere of Shemesh, wherein the sun that is behind the sun focuses into manifestation. In the anatomy of the divine man is the interpretation of all organization and evolution. In fact, the material universe is literally the organs and members of this divine man, and it is through an understanding of the soul of Adam Kadmon, which consists of the influxes of the emanations, that we can interpret his anatomy in terms of function, which is the only way in which anatomy can be intelligently appreciated. It is because science is content largely to be descriptive and shrinks from purpose explanations that it is so barren of all philosophical import. In transcendental psychology, which is the anatomy of the microcosm, the breast is the correspondence assigned to Tiphareth. In the breast are the lungs and the heart, and immediately below these organs and intimately connected with them and controlling them is the greatest network of nerves in the body, known as the solar plexus, aptly so named by the ancient anatomists. The lungs maintain a singularly intimate relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm by determining the ceaseless tidal motion of the atmosphere, in and out, that never ceases day or night, until the gold bowl is broken and the silver cord is loosened and we cease to breathe. The heart determines the circulation of the blood, and the blood, as Paracelsus truly said, is a singular fluid. Modern medicine knows well that sunlight means to the blood. It has also discovered that chlorophyll, which is the green substance in the leaves of plants, which enables them to utilize the sunlight as their source of energy, has a very potent influence upon the blood pressure. The 3 magical images of Tiphareth are curious, for at first sight they are so utterly unrelated that each one appears to cancel out the others. But in the light of what we now know concerning Tiphareth, their significance and relationship appears clearly, speaking through the language of symbolism, especially when studied in the light of the life of Jesus Christ, quote-unquote, the Son. Tiphareth, being the first coagulation of the supernals, is aptly represented as the newborn child in the manger at Bethlehem. As the sacrifice god, he becomes the mediator between God and man, for when he has risen from the dead, he is as a king to his kingdom. Tiphareth is the child of Keter and the king of Malkut, and in his own sphere he is sacrificed. We shall not understand Tiphareth aright unless we have some concept of the real meaning of sacrifice, which is very different to the popular one, which conceives of it as a voluntary loss of something dear. Sacrifice is the translation of force from one form to another. There is no such thing as the total destruction of force. However completely it disappears from our ken, it maintains itself in some other form according to the great natural law of the conservation of energy, which is the law that maintains our universe in existence. Energy may be locked up in form and therefore static, or it may be free from its bondage to form and in circulation. When we make a sacrifice of any sort, we take a static form of energy, and by breaking up the form that imprisons it, put it into free circulation into the cosmos. That which we sacrifice in one form turns up again in due course in another form. Apply this concept to the religious and ethical ideas of sacrifice, and some very valuable clues are observed and obtained. The god name of the sphere is Aloha Ve'adayat, which associates it intimately with the invisible Sephirah that comes between it and Keter. This Sephirah, as we have already seen, may be best understood as apprehension, the dawning of consciousness. And we may interpret the phrase Tetragrammaton Aloha Ve'adayat as God made manifest in the sphere of mind. In the microcosm, Tiphareth represents the higher psychism, the mode of consciousness of the individuality or higher self. It is essentially the sphere of religious mysticism as distinguished from the magic and psychism of Yesod. For be it remembered, the Sephirot of the central pillar of the tree represents levels of consciousness, and the Sephirot on the side pillars represent powers and modes of function. Tiphareth is also said to be the sphere of the great masters. It is the temple not made with hands, eternal in the heavens and the great white lodge. It is here that the initiated adept functions when in the higher consciousness. Here that he comes to meet the masters, and it is by means of the name and by an understanding of the significance of the name of Aloha Ve'adayat that he opens up the higher consciousness. For be it noted that it is only in proportion to the significance a word has for us that it becomes a word of power. The name of his victim is a word of power to a murderer, and such is its recognized potency that in some countries an instrument to register the changes of blood pressure is attached to the arm of a suspect while he is being questioned by the police. And the name of the dead man and other words connected with the crime are suddenly whispered in his ear, and if these words are words of power for him, the instrument registers it beyond a question. It is popularly believed that names of power exercise direct influence over spirits, angels, demons, and such like. But this is not so. The name of power exercises its influence upon the magician, and by exalting and directing consciousness, enables him to get into touch with the chosen type of spiritual influence. If he has had experience of that particular type of influence, the word of power will stir potent subconscious memories. If he has not, and approaches the matter in the unimaginative and incredulous spirit of the scholar, the barbarous names of evocation will be just hocus pocus for him. But be it noted that to the believing Catholic, hocus pocus, which is the Protestant's name for deception and superstition, and from which is derived the word hoax, means hoc est corpus, which is an altogether different story. So much lies in the viewpoint of these matters. Therefore, it is that a definite spiritual experience is assigned to each Sephirah, and until a person has had that experience, he is not an initiate of that Sephirah, and cannot make use of its names of power even if he knows them. As tradition has it, it is not enough to know a name of power. One must also know how to vibrate it. It is generally believed that the vibration of a name of power is the right note on which to chant it. But magical vibration is something much more than that. When one is deeply moved, and at the same time devotionally exalted, the voice drops several tones below its normal pitch and becomes resonant and vibrant. It is this tremor of emotion combined with the resonance of devotion which constitutes the vibration of a name, and this cannot be learned or taught. It can only be spontaneous. It is like the wind, it bloweth where it listeth. When it comes, it shakes one from head to heel with a wave of fiery heat, and all who hear it are involuntarily come to attention. It is an extraordinary experience to hear a word of power vibrated. It is even more extraordinary experience to vibrate it. The archangel of Tiphareth is Raphael, the spirit that standeth in the sun, who is also the angel of healing. When the initiate is working on the tree, that is to say, is building up in his imagination a diagram of the tree of life in his aura, he formulates Tiphareth in his solar plexus between the abdomen and the breast. If he intends to work in the sphere of the sixth Tiphareth, he concentrates the power in the center, for he will find that he himself has suddenly become a spirit standing in the sun, with the blazing photosphere all around him. It is one thing to formulate a Sephirah, one's aura, but it is quite another to find oneself right inside the Sephirah. Although one can receive the influence of a Sephirah by means of the former operation, and it is a good routine method for daily meditation, it is not until one has everted, as it were, turned clean inside out, so that the position is reversed, and instead of the sphere being inside one is inside the sphere, that one can work with the power of a Sephirah. It is this experience which is the culmination of the initiation of a Sephirah. The order of angels of Tiphareth are the Malachim, or kings. These are the spiritual principles of natural forces, and no one can control or even safely make contact with elemental principles unless he holds the initiation of Tiphareth, which is that of a minor adept. For he must have been accepted by the elemental kings, that is to say, he must have realized the ultimate spiritual nature of natural forces before he can handle them in their elemental form. In their subjective elemental form, they appear in the microcosm as powerful instincts of combat, or reproduction, of self-abasement, of self-aggrandizement, and all those emotional factors known to the psychologists. It is obvious, therefore, that if we stir and stimulate these emotions in our natures, it must be in order that we may use them as servants of the higher self, directed by reason and spiritual principle. It is necessary, therefore, that when we operate the elemental forces, we do so through the kings, under the presidency of the archangel, and by the invocation of the holy name of God appropriate to the sphere. Microcosmically, this means that the powerful elemental driving forces of our nature are correlated with the higher self, instead of being disassociated in the cliphotic underworld of the Freudian's unconscious. Elemental operations are not, of course, performed in the sphere of Tiphareth, but it is essential that they should be controlled from the sphere of Tiphareth if they are to remain white magic. If there is no such higher control, they will soon slide off into black magic. It is said that at the fall of the four lower Sephirah became detached from Tiphareth and assimilated into the Qliphoth. When the elemental forces become detached from their spiritual principles in our concepts, so that they become ends in themselves, even if no evil but merely experimentation is attended, a fall takes place, and degeneration soon follows. But when we clearly realize the spiritual principle behind all natural things, they are then in a state of innocence. To use a theological term with a definite connotation, they are unfallen, and we can safely work with them and advantageously develop them in our own natures, thus bringing about the unrepression and equilibrium so necessary to mental health. This correlation of the natural with the spiritual, thus maintaining it unfallen and in a state of innocency, is a very important point in all practical workings in any form of magic. As has already been seen, two spiritual experiences go to make up the initiation of Tiphareth, the vision of the harmony of things and the vision of the mysteries of the crucifixion. We have already seen in another connection that there are two aspects of Tiphareth, and therefore must be two spiritual experiences in this initiation. In the vision of the harmony of things, we see deep into the spiritual side of nature. In other words, we meet the angelic kings, the Malachim. Through this experience, we understand that the natural is but the dense aspect of the spiritual, the outer robe of concealment covering the inner robe of glory. It is this understanding of the spiritual significance of the natural which is so lamentably lacking in our religious life today, and which is responsible for so much neurotic ill health and so much married unhappiness. It is through this vision of the harmony of things that we are made one with nature, not by means of elemental contacts. Human beings who are in any wise raised by culture above the primitive cannot become one with nature upon the elemental level, for to do so is degeneration, and they become beastly in both sense of the word. The nature contacts are made through the angelic kings of the elements in the sphere of Tiphareth. In other words, through the realization of the spiritual principles behind natural things, and the initiate then comes to the elemental beings in the name of their presiding king. He descends into the elemental kingdoms from above, as it were, bringing with him his manhood. Thus he is an initiator of the elementals. But if he meets them on their own level, he abrogates his manhood and returns to an earlier phase of evolution. Elemental force, not limited and kept in check by the limitations of an animal brain, is bound to be unbalanced force when it flows through the wide channels of a human intellect, and the result is chaos, which is one of the kingdoms of the Qliphoth. The mysteries of the crucifixion are both macrocosmic and microcosmic. In their macrocosmic aspect, we find them in the midst of the great redeemers of mankind, who are always born a god and a virgin mother, thus again emphasizing the dual nature of Tiphareth, wherein form and force meet together. But let us not forget their microcosmic aspect as an experience of mystical consciousness. It is by means of an understanding of the mysteries of the crucifixion, which concern the magical power of sacrifice, that we are able to transcend the limitations of brain consciousness, limited to sensation and habituated to form, and enter into the wider consciousness of the higher psychism. We thus become able to transcend form and thereby release the latent force, changing it from static to kinetic and rendering it available for the great work, which is regeneration. The characteristic virtue of the sphere of Tiphareth is devotion to the great work. Devotion is a very important factor in the way of initiation that leads to the higher consciousness, and we must therefore examine it carefully and analyze it into the factors of which it consists. Devotion might be defined as love for something higher than ourselves, something that evokes our idealism, which, while we despair of becoming equal to it, yet makes us aspire to become like it. Beholding as in a glass the glory of the Lord, are changed into the same image from glory to glory. When a stronger emotional content is infused with devotion and it becomes adoration, it carries us across the great gulf fixed between the tangible and intangible, and enables us to apprehend things that eye hath not seen nor ear heard. It is this devotion rising to adoration in the great work which initiates us into the mysteries of the crucifixion. The vice assigned to Tiphareth is pride, and in this attribution we have some very true psychology. Pride has its roots in egoism, and as long as we are self-centered, we cannot be made one with all things. In the true selflessness of this path, the soul overflows its boundaries and enters into all things through limitless sympathy and perfect love. But in pride, the soul tries to extend its boundaries till it possesses all things, and it is a very different matter to possess a thing to being made one with it, wherein it equally possesses us in perfect reciprocity. It is this one-sided arrangement which is the vice of the adept. He must give as well as receive, and he must give himself unreservedly if he would participate in mystical union, which is the fruit of the sacrifice of crucifixion. Let him who would be the greatest among you be the servant of all, said, quote-unquote, our Lord. The symbols associated with Tiphareth are the layman, the rosy cross, the Calvary cross, the truncated pyramid, and the cube. The layman is the symbol upon the breast of the adept and indicates the force he represents. An adept performing a work in the sphere of Shemesh, for instance, would wear upon his breast an image of the sun in splendor. A layman is a magical weapon of Tiphareth, and is therefore becomes necessary to say something concerning the nature of magical weapons in general in order that the function of a layman can be misunderstood. A magical weapon is some object which is found to be suitable as a vehicle for force of a particular type. For instance, the magical weapon of the element of water is a cup or chalice. The magical weapon of the element of fire is a lighted lamp. These objects are chosen because their nature is congenial to that of the force to be invoked, or in modern language, because their form suggests the form to the imagination by association of ideas. Tiphareth is traditionally associated with the breast, both by virtue of the network of nerves, which is called the solar plexus, and by its position when the tree is built up in the aura. Consequently, the breast jewel of the adept is held to be the focus of the Tipharic force, whatever operation may be performed. The actual force operating in its own sphere is represented by the magical weapon assigned to it. For instance, an adept performing an operation of the element of water would have as his magical weapon the cup, and with the cup would make all signs, and upon the cup would concentrate the force called down by invocation. But upon his breast would be the sigil of the element of water, and this would be recognized as representing the spiritual factor in the operation, and as referring to the archangel over that particular kingdom. Unless the adept understands the significance of his layman as distinguished from his magical weapon, he is no adept but a wizard. The Rosy Cross and the Calvary Cross are both given as symbols of the sphere of Tiphareth. In order to understand their significance, it is necessary to say something concerning crosses in general and how they are used in system of symbolism. Although the cross with which we are most generally familiar is the Calvary Cross, owing to its association with Christianity, there are many other forms of cross, and each has its own significance. The equal armed cross, such as the Red Cross of the Army Medical Service, is called by initiates the cross of nature and represents power and equilibrium. It is to be found at the top of some Celtic crosses and often enclosed in a circle, so that a Celtic cross actually consists of a tapering shaft ending in a nature cross, which has no relationship whatever to the Calvary cross, which is the cross of Christianity. The tapering shaft of the Celtic cross is, in actual fact, a truncated pyramid, and examples of this type of Celtic cross exist, which leave no doubt upon this point whatsoever. Some archaic forms suggest the imposition of the cross and circle upon the conical phallic stone, which is so universal an object in primitive worship. The swastika is also a nature cross and is sometimes called the cross of Thor or the hammer of Thor, its form being supposed to indicate the whirling action of his thunderbolts. The Calvary cross is the cross of sacrifice and should properly be colored black. Its shaft should be 3 times the length of its arms, and the length of each arm 3 times its width. Meditation on this cross brings initiation through suffering, sacrifice, and self-abnegation. The crucifix is, of course, an elaboration of the Calvary cross. The circle upon the cross is an initiatory symbol, especially when the cross is raised upon 3 steps, as it should be in this form. The circle indicates eternal life, also wisdom, and we see a form of it in the emblem of the Theosophical Society, which has for its badge, serpent that holdeth his tail in his mouth. A Calvary cross with the circle superimposed means initiation by the way of the cross, and the 3 steps are the 3 degrees of illumination. It is this way is the so-called rosy cross. The fanciful object with brambles growing over it is not an initiatory symbol at all. The rose associated with the cross in Western symbolism is the Rosa Mundi, and is a key to the interpretation of the nature forces. On its petals are marked the 32 signs of the natural forces. These correspond to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet and the 10 holy Sephirot. These, in their turn, are assigned to the 32 paths on the tree of life. And this is the key to the understanding of the Rosa Mundi. The curious scribbles that are called the sigils of the elementary spirits are made by drawing lines from one to another of the letters of their names on the rose. In the light of this explanation, we are at no loss to understand the value of the claims of those organizations which sport a floral emblem as their symbol. They are on a par with those of the gentleman who demanded of his haberdasher a public school tie with a bit of a red in it. The cube is usually said to be assigned to Tiphareth because it is a 6-sided figure, and 6 is the number of Tiphareth. But there is more than this in the symbolism of the cube. The cube is the simplest form of solid, and as such is the appropriate symbol of Tiphareth, in whose sphere is found the first foreshadowing of form. The symbol of Malkut is the double cube, which symbolizes as above, so below. The pyramid symbolizes the perfected man, broad-based on earth and tapering it to unity in the heavens. In other words, the episimus. The truncated pyramid symbolizes the initiated adept or adeptus minor who has passed within the veil but has not yet completed his grades. This pyramid, to whose 6 sides correspond the 6 central sephira, which constitute Adam Kadmon, or the archetypal man, is completed by the addition of the 3 supernals which terminate in the unity of Keter. The 6s of the tarot suits are also assigned to Tiphareth, and in them the harmonious and balanced nature of this sephira shows clearly. The 6 of Wands is the Lord of Victory, the 6 of Cups the Lord of Joy. Even the maleficent suit of Swords is tuned to harmony in this sphere, and the 6 of Swords is known as the Lord of Earned Success. That is to say, success achieved after struggle. The 6 of Pentacles is material success. In other words, power and equilibrium. So that is your long-winded lesson for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Welcome. Thank you again for leaving the blah, 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 the Dr. Zeero Show. Hit the subscribe button. Let people know I exist. Play with tarot cards. Go buy a deck. Pick up this book I was reading from, The Mystical Kabbalah by Diane Fortune, Miss Violet Firth. All kinds of interesting stuff she put out. And just like all occult writers, there's a slight tinge of crank to her. But there's a slight tinge of crank to us all, is there not? So, have a good evening, folks. See you around.